Good afternoon, and welcome to IMA's Insight Talk Faculty Friday webinar series. The title of today's presentation is Helping Students Develop an Ethical Mindset. I'm Margaret Lockery, and I'll be your host for today's Faculty Friday webinar. It's a pleasure to have Terry Mormile as part of our program, and she will be serving as moderator for today's event. Terry is the Director of Educational Initiatives and Career Services in the Education and Career Services area at IMA. In this position, she leads a variety of new product initiatives, including development of the IMA Strategy and Competitive Analysis Learning Series, which is the educational support package for the CSCA exam, as well as the expansion of the Career Driver product offering. Terry is a part of a team responsible for IMA's continuing education product line, including online products, webinars, and future CPE offerings, in alignment with IMA's broader mission to provide educational value and knowledge to members. Hi, Terry. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm pleased to be a part of the Faculty Friday webinar series, and on behalf of IMA, I want to welcome everyone to today's session. At this time, I'd like to introduce our featured presenter. With us today, we have Susan Wolcott. Susan is the thought leader for professional education at CPA Canada and an educational consultant with WolcottLynch Associates in Bellevue. She works with educators around the world to support critical thinking and ethical reasoning development, competency assessment, and curriculum innovation. Susan currently teaches at the Indian School of Business, Hyderabad, previously taught at the University of Iowa, Aalto University in Finland, University of Washington, IE Business School in Madrid, University of Denver, and Northwestern University. Prior to her academic career, Susan worked in public accounting for 10 years, including at Coopers & Lybrand in Portland, Oregon. She holds a PhD and an MS in Accounting and Information Systems from Northwestern University, as well as a BBA in Accounting from the University of Portland. Susan is the co-author of Cost Management, Measuring, Monitoring, and Motivating Performance, published by Wiley. Her textbook includes ethical reasoning examples and many cases in every chapter. Along with other members of an IMA MAS task force, she developed a new framework for accounting education, calling for greater focus on students' long-run careers. Susan developed a model for professional judgment and ethical behavior for CPA Canada's pre-certification programs and is currently working on a major project to define accountants' career-spanning technical and professional, i.e. soft, competencies. Please join me in welcoming Susan Wolcott.
Thank you. I'm pleased to participate in today's program.
Great. Before turning the presentation over to Susan, I'd like to go over the learning objectives for today's program. After participating in this webinar, you will be able to describe the impact of mindset on ethical behavior. You should be able to explain how blind spots can affect ethical behavior. You will recognize the influence of cognitive biases and implicit biases on ethical behavior. And finally, you should be able to discuss methods for engaging students in discussions about ethical mindset. We're looking forward to an informative presentation, so at this time I'm going to turn your attention to Susan.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just share with you all my personal journey for ethics education. I started, as perhaps many of you, teaching an auditing course and really focusing just on the professional code of conduct. And then over time, as I started increasing my focus on critical thinking in my courses, I started adding to the courses typically just one ethical reasoning assignment. So over time, then I started developing more models of ethical reasoning like the ones that I'll share with you today. In recent years, I've been moving into ethical mindset and looking at the fact that reasoning alone is not enough to ensure that people actually behave ethically. And so I've been dabbling, I would say, for about 10 years, looking at different models and experimenting in my classrooms and trying to kind of understand how I might help students understand and develop a more appropriate mindset for ethical behavior. And so that's the focus of today's workshop. I'll also make just a couple very brief comments about organizational ethics. The scenario we will talk about today actually involves organizational ethics. So let me begin by sharing this scenario. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard about the fraud at Wells Fargo. Now, actually, it turns out Wells Fargo has done several things wrong, but the piece I'm going to focus on right now is just the creation of fake bank accounts and credit card accounts. And basically, I've gone out and done a lot of research trying to understand kind of the timeline of the events that occurred. And this slide kind of summarizes that. So when you're teaching ethics, there are obviously a variety of different ways you can present information to students. This is one technique I sometimes use, a timeline showing major events. And you'll notice that back approximately 2005 was the earliest information I could find about the idea that employees at Wells Fargo were creating fake bank accounts. And there were some attempts by employees back in those days to blow the whistle. And then in 2013, the LA Times published a story about the high pressure on employees at Wells Fargo and the fact that the employees were creating fake accounts. And what I find really interesting about this case is that it takes 3 more years before something actually begins to happen. In other words, I don't know what was going on inside Wells Fargo, but I do know that there was public information available as early as 2005 and certainly in the form of a major news story in 2013, and yet it took 3 more years before we started seeing the management of the company actually beginning to change their performance measurement systems, and that happened to coincide with a big fine from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So basically the government got involved and then management got involved. So when I look at a situation like this, I have to ask myself, whose mindsets are we talking about? And there are a lot of them involved in this scenario. We have the board of directors. We have the top management of the company. We have the branch managers who are overseeing the employees who are actually creating these fake accounts. And then, of course, we have the employees who are creating the fake accounts. And then in addition to that, we have external auditors of the financial statements. And then all banks have an internal audit department. And I haven't seen any information in the news stories, but I have to assume that there was an internal audit department there. So when we're talking about mindset, it's not just one person's mindset in this situation. There are lots of individual people involved, and their mindsets matter, but it's also this organizational mindset that seems to be at issue. So when I know that some of you probably participated in the webinar I conducted at 1 p.m. this afternoon, where I talked about using an ethical reasoning model to teach ethical reasoning. And you'll notice that the model I'm showing here on this slide is similar but a slightly modified version of the one that I talked about in the last webinar. So first of all, we want people to be able to identify ethical issues. We want them to be able to analyze potential alternatives in a thorough and objective way. And then we want them to be able to apply values and then to reach a conclusion. Now, in our courses, obviously, it tends to stop there. We ask students to say, well, what would you do? What would you recommend, etc., and it tends to stop there. But in the real world, that's not where it stops. In the real world, it stops one step further, and that is, what's the actual behavior? So, basically what this version of the model shows is that you can think about it, but you have to actually behave as well. And then there are a couple more pieces. Usually, ethical scenarios involve multiple people. At a minimum, you may want to talk to somebody about what's going on. And then there's the mindset piece, which I'll be focusing on in today's webinar. So you can think about kind of this being a more thorough model of ethical behavior as opposed to just focusing on ethical reasoning. Just for your information, you'll notice in the introduction to me that I work a lot with CPA Canada, And I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that I created a model called the CPA Way for CPA Canada. And in the bottom left-hand part of the slide, there's a URL. These resources are freely available, and it's encouraged that people use them. And in Canada, a lot of the accounting educators have downloaded these resources and are using them with their students. Now, obviously, this focuses on the Canadian accounting profession, so the code of conduct is named differently than what we're talking about and so forth. But what I wanted to show you here is that you'll notice in the diagram, there's in the left-hand part of the bottom left-hand corner of that diagram, there's a hat there, and underneath it says the CPA mindset. So the resources out there in CPA Canada has a module of materials that focus on the mindset, and there's another module that focuses overall on ethical behavior. So you might want to download these, even if you don't use them with your students. You might find some really good ideas for use with your students in these resources. So one of the questions we have is what do we mean by an ethical mindset? And the reality is that we might mean a whole bunch of different things. And a lot of people think it just means you just find the right answer and then you do it. You know, that's what you do. And what this slide is intended to show is that there are many, many different words that might be associated with both ethics and that are somehow related to a mindset. Here are some examples. Some of these words on this screen refer to rules, like, you know, no conflict of interest. And so we might say, well, we're prohibited. So that means that we have to have a mindset so that we're become aware of conflicts of interest and then avoid them. Another type of word that we see here has to do with the approach that we as accountants might take of our work. For example, we need to exercise due care. And we need to apply professional judgment. So again, as we are approaching problems, due care and professional judgment would include recognizing when we're dealing with an ethical scenario and doing something about it. Some of the other words on this screen relate to values such as honesty or fairness. And those might lead to criteria that we use when we're trying to choose an appropriate response. So this is an example of something you can do with your students. You could either give them a diagram like this and kind of help them say, well, these are all aspects of the mindset, or you might even have a classroom activity where you have them create the set of words that surround this. One of the things I want you to be aware of is that I actually chose a lot of the words on that diagram from the IMA's Statement of Ethical Professional Practice. So here's the URL for that, plus a couple more articles that I think are really helpful for ethics education. And so what I did, for example, is I went through the Statement of Ethical Professional Practice, and I picked out words related to, that could be tied to mindset, and I put them all on that screen, along with some other words that I thought might be useful. Just as a side comment, that last article on this slide called Everyday Ethics, Tougher Than You Think, actually covers a lot of the ground that I'll be discussing today. And I think that's important for, if you want to go back and read that article, you'll see how it fits in with the mindset concepts. I use professional standards such as this to help motivate the students. So I see that we have arrived at our first poll question. I'm going to turn attention to our moderator, Terry.
Thank you, Susan. Attendees should see the first polling question now open on your screen. I would like to remind all participants that you will have about 30 seconds to respond to each of the polling questions today. You may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on the screen. Our first polling question is, which of the following courses will be your primary focus during today's webinar? A, financial accounting, B, management or cost accounting, C, tax accounting, D, assurance, E, something else. Please note that after selecting an answer, you must click the Submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen, just below the response options, in order to successfully record your answer. Now I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Susan.
Okay, thank you. Let's look at the results here. I'm not at all surprised. Almost 50% of you are teaching management or cost accounting. Since this is an IMA webinar, that makes perfect sense. But I see that a fair number of you are also teaching financial accounting, and then chunk something else. I'm not sure what that is. But I'm going to be focusing, I'm going to share with you some examples from different kinds of courses today, although my biggest focus will be in cost accounting. Okay, what I'm going to do now is kind of talk about some of the types of problems that can interfere with mindset. So the first one we're going to discuss is something called blind spots. So before I jump into what blind spots are, let me just briefly mention what we hope is going to happen. So we have this ethical reasoning model and this notion that we need to behave according to that model. And you might say, oh, everything looks so funny and good. So we teach students, how to think about problems, and we say, okay, just go do it, and then that's fine. And in a sense, and this is in the language of the researchers who created the model called blind spots, they refer to this as what we should do, quote, should do. The problem is that blind spots interfere with what we should do. So these 4 bullet points in the middle of the slide kind of outline the key drivers of these blind spots. Number 1, we believe we are more ethical than we are. Number 2, we classify ethical decisions as something else. In other words, we fail to recognize the ethical scenario. 3, we are unduly influenced by reward systems, and of course that's a big topic in cost and management accounting. And 4, we fail to see others' unethical behavior, which I think is kind of interesting. So basically these are kind of drivers, things that can interfere. Let me back up for a second. You'll notice down on the bottom of this slide, there's a reference to the book called Blind Spots. And if you've never read any of this material, this book is really good. And a lot of the ideas that I have put in the following slides come from that book. So here's basically what they say. At the time that we go to make a decision, what happens is ethical reasoning fades into the background. If we think, when we have students and we give them an assignment and we say, well, what would you do? Ethical reasoning is in the forefront. But when it comes to actual behavior, it fades into the background. And what we want to do takes over. And there are 4 big components to the want to do. One is the incentive and reward system. Another is time pressure. And of course, accountants are always subject to time pressure. Another is motivational blindness, like, do I want to actually see the problem? And then finally, and I'm going to come back and talk in more detail about this later, conscious and unconscious biases. And so those are things that tend to take precedent at the time we're actually making decisions. So the interference itself tends to look like this. As I said before, what happens is we fail to recognize ethical issues, we fail to fully explore them, and we are unaware of the fact that we have biases and various forces that cause us to behave in an unethical manner. So this is, basically blind spots impact the entire model, the whole thing, and we no longer are doing what we should. The authors of the book Blind Spot have several different suggestions because these blind spots are not known. In other words, by definition, a blind spot is something you're not aware of, or you might not be aware of. Because they're unknown, they can be very difficult to avoid. And so the authors have recommended some strategies. The first strategy is to plan and reflect to allow time to recognize and fully explore ethical issues. In other words, slow down. And given things like time constraints, that's a real problem for many accountants. The second strategy is to use decision-making strategies to emphasize what you should do versus what you want to do. And that's why teaching an ethical reasoning model and then also teaching students about things like these blind spots so that they're aware of them, they can more likely go, oh, am I actually ignoring these problems? And should I instead focus my attention on them? Another strategy is to pre-commit to an ethical action. And that one sounds really straightforward, and I think for students they're going to go, oh yeah, of course I can pre-commit, but of course in reality things are always more complicated than it sounds. And then finally, we can actively learn how to recognize and avoid our own and others' biases and distortions. And I would like to suggest that one of the focuses that we might want to increase in our accounting courses is this notion of bias. Now, cost and management accounting have often talked about bias in the form of things like, a biased cost function or something like that. And that's fine. We're already talking about it, but this is the kind of thing that we might want to insert into all of the accounting courses. So here are some examples. So the scenario I shared with you earlier about Wells Fargo. I could pose different kinds of questions to different students. So here's a question that might work for financial accounting, management accounting, or an assurance course. Suppose you're a staff internal auditor at Wells Fargo during 2013 when the LA Times publishes a story about the bank's fake account. What, if anything, would you do? Be sure to consider the possible effects of blind spots. Okay, so that's a possible either a classroom discussion topic or an assignment topic. Here's another one in cost accounting or management control systems. Suppose you work in the accounting department at the headquarters of Wells Fargo. During early 2017, the controller asked for your advice about possible ways to revise the company's incentive system. The management team wants to reduce the risk that employees will create fake bank accounts. Be sure to consider the possible effects of blind spots. And then finally, again in cost accounting or management control systems, during 2017, the management team at Wells Fargo eliminated the following part of the company's incentive plan. Quote, employees must achieve product sales goal minimums to receive incentives, end quote. Do you agree with this decision? Would this change help to reduce blind spots? So, like I said, these are just examples of the kinds of questions that you might ask. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that I added blind spots to all three of these scenarios. You wouldn't necessarily have to do that. However, if you decide you want to teach your students about blind spots or about some of the other kinds of biases that I'm going to introduce later, including those in your assignments is a good thing to do. But obviously, without some kind of guidance or advanced discussion, the students would have real trouble. They'd have no idea what you're getting at. And you might want to add even more guidance to help the students do a better job on these questions. So I would like to refer you to the earlier webinar. For any of you who did not attend that webinar, it'll be accessible later on the IMA website, so you can always download the slides and take a look at some of the design, assignment design ideas that I included in that webinar. So I see we've arrived at our second poll question. I'm going to turn your attention to our moderator, Terry.
Thank you, Susan. As you know, you may begin responding to the poll questions immediately, and you will have about 30 seconds to respond to each question. Our second question today is, which of the following drivers of blind spots do you think is most important for accounting students to learn? A, incentives, rewards. B, time pressure. C, motivational blindness. D, conscious, unconscious bias. After choosing an answer, please be sure to click the Submit button located below the response option so that we may record your answer. Now it's back to Susan.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like the largest percent is interested in the conscious and unconscious biases, and I'm going to be introducing those in more detail shortly. And then the other, the most popular topic is incentives and rewards. Obviously, there's no one correct answer here. I was mainly just kind of curious as to what your interests were. Let me just comment. Obviously, if you're teaching, any kind of accounting course, incentives and rewards tends to somehow interact with the course topics. So there's a natural fit in there with a lot of this mindset issues. So let's take a look at another way. So I'm going to move kind of past the model, the book called Blind Spots, and I'm going to kind of look at some of these problems through a different framework. And one way of thinking about it is that our brains themselves often are doing things that we don't know. So unconsciously, our brain is designed to seek shortcuts and to apply rules of thumb and to engage in stereotyping. And, you know, recently, of course, we had the big brouhaha regarding Starbucks and the fact that a manager at a Starbucks store asked some customers who were waiting for someone else to join them. The Starbucks asked those people to leave. The customers happened to be black, and then it got videotaped, so, you know, I'm sure you heard the stories, et cetera. And one of the responses that Starbucks Corporation had was they decided to close down all of their stores on a particular day, and they engaged in sensitivity training. And one of the questions is whether sensitivity training is really enough. In other words, our brains don't know necessarily that we're biased. So if we're talking about something like racism, some people are overtly racist. They know that they hate people of other races, and they're totally aware of it. Other people may not believe that they are racist at all, and yet their brains are engaging in stereotyping. They're applying rules of thumb. They're shortcutting their decision and their thinking, and that tends to result in racist kinds of behavior. So one of the questions we have is sensitivity training enough? I mean, it can certainly help, but it might not be enough. So what I'm going to do now is introduce what are called cognitive biases, and there are tons of these. I mean, I think I went out to the Wikipedia website, and I think there's like 200 of them listed on Wikipedia's site. So what I did here was I went to a publication called the Center of Audit Quality's Professional Judgment Resource. And in this publication, they identify a number of cognitive biases. And so I wanted to summarize some of these. These are really common cognitive biases. The first one is called confirmation bias, where basically you place more weight on your initial beliefs about something. And we see this a lot. It's a really common problem with business decision making and auditing and everything else. A second one here is overconfidence, where we overestimate our own ability and we rely inappropriately on our own judgment. Another one is the anchoring bias, where we place too much weight on an initial piece of information and we fail to seek disconfirming information or to apply sufficient techniques. And then the last one on this slide is the availability bias, where we focus on easily retrievable information and we over-rely then on information that, because it's easily retrievable, doesn't necessarily mean it's good information. It might be biased and we're relying on it. So these are, I think, really good examples of these kinds of biases, and the publication, of course, talks about it in the context of auditor judgment, but quite frankly, there's nothing unique to auditing about these biases. So these biases would apply potentially to any of our courses. I have been experimenting and dabbling, if you will, in cognitive bias for a number of years. My co-author, Leslie Eldenberg, and I decided to include cognitive biases, one type of cognitive bias in each chapter of our cost accounting textbook. And so we kind of described what the bias is, and we tried to look for scenarios that demonstrated the bias, and then we designed some homework questions that relate to it. So I just wanted to share some ways that you can kind of attach these cognitive biases to your course content. So one is called the overconfidence trap, where managers may fail to adequately consider risk. And I think one of the types of events that we've been seeing in the news media very recently are E. coli infections of food. I mean, we've got this whole thing about not being able to eat various kinds of lettuce, and there have been 2 major incidents in the last year. So one of the questions is, well, can accountants help with this type of thing? And so one possibility is that accountants can help managers by performing sensitivity analyses and by potentially reducing the expectations for, quote, the average case scenario and brainstorming to identify potential worst case scenarios. I mean, if you're a food company, I think a worst case scenario is a really bad E. coli infection problem. So if managers haven't been taking that type of thing into account, maybe the accountants can help them with that. Another possibility is the optimism bias. And we see this all the time. Suppose I'm a manager and I am proposing either the development of a new product or a capital budgeting project or something. Now, if I am the manager promoting this thing, am I likely to be unbiased in the data that I present to try to get it approved? The answer is probably not. So I may be overly optimistic if I'm the person making this proposal. Another possibility is called the positive illusions bias, and I don't know if you can see the little diagram there, but there's an egg with a halo, and then there's an egg with little devils, that looks like a devil. And the idea here is that some people believe they are superior, and they might claim an unrealistically large proportion of credit for positive outcomes and blame either others or external factors for negative outcomes. And so these types of managers might hold employees responsible for performance targets that simply can't be attained. Another possibility is the status quo bias. And this is a scenario that we found for our cost accounting textbook where we looked at a news story involving a food processing plant. And the story involves a consultant walking into this company, and this plant is making soup. And it turns out the consultant's walking around and notices like there's a whole bunch of soup pouring out of one of these machines and it's going down the drain. And the consultant goes, "What is that?" And apparently the employees who worked there had just been ignoring it because their costs were within their budget and nobody was complaining about them running over their costs. So everybody was ignoring it. It was the status quo. The consultant said, "Wait a minute, let's try to estimate how much money is literally going down the drain here." So the consultant estimated that the annual loss was $750,000, and it cost only $50,000 to fix the problem. So there's a really good example where status quo is discouraging people from taking actions that might actually improve their well-being. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about cognitive biases, I think Wikipedia is a wonderful resource. One of the pages on Wikipedia is titled List of Cognitive Biases. And on that page, there are three big categories of cognitive biases. One type refers to decision-making, belief, and behavioral biases. A second category are social biases. And a third category are memory errors and biases. So, like I said, there are a lot of really good resources out there. So what Leslie Eldenberg and I did when we were looking for ideas for this, basically we just read stories about companies and we said, gosh, this looks like there's some bias involved. And then we went to Wikipedia, well, which of these biases looks like it fits this scenario? And so that's kind of how we put this together. We rarely found an article that said, oh, here's this particular cognitive bias that's driving something. But instead what we did was we looked for problems in the business world, and then we said, well, is there a type of bias potentially associated with this? This is another type, and this is really related back to the Starbucks example that I mentioned earlier, this notion of in-group versus out-group bias. We favor people in our in-group, and we prefer people in our in-group versus people in our out-group. And that's a really, so that could be racially motivated, it could be gender, it could be age, it could be what country you're from, it could be just plain like within a company, one team of people might become an in-group and everybody outside of that team is out-group. I mean, this can play out in many, many different ways. The issue here is that we might or might not be aware of our bias. As I mentioned earlier, some of these biases are explicit. We might know that we have this bias, and in other cases we have absolutely no idea, but we behave as if this bias exists. So then the questions become, well, what if I have this bias and I don't know it? The term that a lot of people use to describe this type of cognitive bias, they use the term implicit biases. So that's kind of what I will use for the next three slides here. So when I look at thinking about that Starbucks example, what we don't know was whether the Starbucks store manager was conscious or unconscious of the bias. So one possible assessment, and I've actually used this assessment with students in multiple different courses at different universities, and I have personally gone out and taken this assessment myself, I think about 3 different times. The good news is this is an example of an assessment that's free of charge, so you can have your students take this without paying any money for it. And it's an academic type of project. You notice there are 4 universities here involved in the project. The project is housed on, I think, Harvard's website. And you can go out and, pick a classification of a potential type of implicit bias, and then you can take an assessment. It's a really unique type of assessment. The first time I took it, I was extremely skeptical. But I've been reading articles about this over time, and I'm becoming a little bit more, I think I'm beginning to believe it more now than I did 10 years ago, let's put it that way. But it's still a very unique experience, and I think it might be worth having either you doing it yourself or having your students do it. So we have reached our next polling question, and I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Terry.
Okay, thank you. Attendees may respond to this poll question immediately as I read through the question. Our third polling question for today is, how important is it for your accounting students to learn about biases such as blind spots, cognitive biases, and implicit biases? A, highly important, B, moderately important, C, somewhat important, D, not important. After selecting your answer, please be sure to click the Submit button to ensure that your response is recorded. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Oh, I'm very happy to see this. Look at 61% of you think this is highly important, and 29 moderately important. I assume that one of the concerns many of you have right now is how are you going to try to fit this into your courses? So what I'm going to share with you now are some ideas of how I've done this with students. So remember, in today's webinar, we are focusing on ethical mindset, so I'm going to kind of narrow my thinking to that. But obviously, these biases can affect all kinds of decision-making beyond ethical scenarios. So a lot of the ideas I'm going to share can be applied equally to ethical situations or other types of situations. So here's an example of an assignment that I gave to students in a first-year undergraduate course. I used to teach every year for about 10 years or so in Finland. I should point out to you that I found that Finnish students tend to be about 1 cognitive level higher than average students in the U.S. So this assignment might be a little advanced for a typical undergrad, but I think undergraduates in the U.S. could focus on this. So what I had done is I had given the students ahead of time a video about mindset, and I had talked with them specifically about objectivity and skepticism. In other words, the idea of trying to prevent reaching a conclusion too soon and then remaining skeptical about your various ideas. And I had provided them with a list of some specific cognitive biases in that video, but I didn't explain them. In other words, all I did was sort of motivate the idea, why do we care about this? And then I listed some. So this assignment then, I'm asking the students to refer to the video, and I asked them to pick one of the cognitive biases and briefly do research on the internet to obtain a description of the bias, and then explain how that bias might cause someone to have distorted judgment on an assignment that they had previously completed in my course. So as I said before, I tied this in with an ethics assignment, but it didn't have to be an ethics assignment. It could have been something else. But I found my students rather eager to discuss this, and so I got them together in groups during class, and they talked about, they shared with each other their ideas, and then we talked about it as a large class. Here's another assignment that I've used actually with that same group of students in Finland. I sent them out to the website that on that Harvard website that has the Project Implicit website, and I asked them to pick one or more of the tests. In other words, I didn't tell them which of the tests to take. There are, I can't remember, I think there are around 15 different tests there. And so they picked one or more, and then I had them complete a self-reflection. So they had to submit, they didn't have to submit to me their test, they had to submit their self-reflection. And the self-reflection was pretty simple. Briefly describe what you learned from this test. So I'm asking them to think about themselves, and I'm asking them to consider the possibility that the test may have shown them to be biased, and then to have them sort of, think about whether they're biased and what that might mean. Again, I had them divided into groups on the day that this assignment was due, and they talked about it among themselves, and then we talked about it as a large class. This is a different type of assignment. I used this one time with students, and what I was trying to do, this one is, I don't know, it's kind of a lengthy assignment, and I think it works best if you have a lot of time to work on the part 3 of the ethical reasoning model, where you're asking students to actually apply values to reach a conclusion. And one of the things I've noticed is that students often really don't know what values are. And so I found a website, and the URL is here on this page, that lists a set of possible personal values, cultural values, social values, and work values. And then what I did was I had each student pick their top 4, like which of those values you think is important to you personally, and why is it important. So I had them do it for each of these 4 categories. So there's 2 slides here. So I had them do this for the 4 categories, and then in class, I had them bring their printed copy, and then divided them into groups, and then they compared and discussed. And again, the idea here is not necessarily to drive a particular learning other than personal exploration of what values might tend to drive. And I asked them in this case to relate it specifically to an assignment that they had previously completed. So I'm having them kind of reflecting, what values am I using? And there are lots of others, and I've experimented with a bunch of different kinds. There's something called tolerance for ambiguity. I didn't include that one here, partly because the model itself is not recognized as necessarily highly reliable. However, I should mention that I've used this with students rather successfully, and let me just quickly share with you a story. There was one time I was teaching students a course on critical thinking, and I required every student in the course to go out and take this tolerance for ambiguity, and then I had them report their results to me, and then I put together a little chart that showed the distribution of the scores in the class. So I didn't have them share with each other what their scores were, but I had so that they could kind of see, some people had a low tolerance, some people kind of medium, some high tolerance. And there was a project due in this course, and I had the students meet with me, each group working on the project. I had them meet individually, each group individually with me, and part of what they had to do is they had to show me a mind map that they had created of this project that they were going to be performing, and discuss with me their plan. And of course, as I met with each team, I was making some suggestions for some possible modifications to their plan to improve the quality of their work. And with one of the groups of students, there was this one student who kept resisting every single suggestion. But we already made a plan, but that's going to take us longer. I mean, she was like really unhappy with this idea that I was messing with the plan that the group had already put together. And it just happened that during that same meeting, I was sharing with the students their tolerance for ambiguity scores and having this little small group discussion about them. And this particular student who was complaining was one of the ones with the low tolerance for ambiguity scores. And it was so funny because when I shared that with her, she went, oh, it was like this. All of a sudden, she became aware that she was resisting more than everybody else. And I think, that's the kind of learning opportunity that you're hoping will happen in your courses. I've also used Myers-Briggs. There are other personality tests that you can do this with. Many of you might be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. She has a model called Fixed versus Growth Mindset. There's been a lot of news stories about her model lately. I've used that. Also, there's an online assessment that you can have students so the previous examples where I have the students go out and take an assessment and reflect on it, I've done that with Fixed versus Growth Mindset as well. All of these can be used in conjunction with self-reflection and reflection on performance on ethics or other kinds of assignments. So we have arrived at our fourth poll question. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Terry.
Thank you, Susan. As with the previous questions, you may respond immediately when I read the question and response options. Our fourth poll question for today is, which of the following most closely describes your attitude about engaging students with mindset activities in your courses? Please choose from the following. A, I am already doing this and agree that it is important. B, I am not currently doing this, but I believe that it is important. C, I believe that someone other than me should do this. D, I do not believe it is important. E, something else. Please take a moment to select your answer. Now I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it looks like most of you are not currently doing this, but you do believe that it's important. So I've got my fingers crossed here that you'll come away from this webinar with some ideas. But I'm really happy also to see that many of you in here are already doing this, and I think that's really, really great. I wanted to share with you just a couple more thoughts before we close the webinar today. First of all, there are different ways you can kind of create models, and the model that I showed you earlier is one way of sort of inserting mindset into a model. This is another one that's similar to what I've seen in some books on ethics, where you kind of say, well, ethical reasoning plus the mindset plus communication equals or maybe goes to ethical behavior. So in other words, I don't think you necessarily need to follow any one model. The idea is whatever works with you. And as I said earlier, this is the model as I've been using it with students. And I kind of like this idea of putting the mindset in these really big letters off to the side. But that's entirely up to you as to whether you use any of these models or something else. I want to leave you with some resources. I have a website with freely available resources, and I also my website includes a link to my YouTube page, which has some videos on cognitive development and kind of patterns of thinking. And there tend to be biases embedded in the patterns of thinking that different people have. And I have personally found it really helpful as a teacher in trying to understand my students, knowing these patterns of thinking, kind of, why is this student struggling with something and somebody else is struggling with something entirely different than that. And I encourage you to get in touch with me if you ever want to discuss any of these ideas. And I have a LinkedIn page where I tend not to write my own postings, but I post a lot of articles that have to do with biases, critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and education. So if you're interested in any of that, just sign up on my page. And I think I will now turn the session back over to our moderator, Terry.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to begin addressing some of the questions from our audience members. Let me first remind participants to send us your questions and comments by typing them into the Q&A panel on the left side of your screen. Our first question today is it realistic to expect accounting professors to teach mindset, which is far removed from accounting topics?
Well, I was really happy in that last poll question to see that many of you are doing this. But many of you aren't yet doing it, and you're interested in it, or you think it's important. And I think one of our biggest challenges here is that as accountants, we probably have very little training in this. So what I have personally done over time is I've simply, done, looked, like I said, I started with Wikipedia, okay, what does Wikipedia say? And then over time, I've read books like Carol Dweck's book on fixed and growth mindset, the Blind Spots book, and so on. By the way, that IMA article that I mentioned previously on that early slide, the one that was down on the bottom of the IMA resources, that article has a list of really good books. So if you're new in dealing with all of this, I think the books in that article are perfect examples of the kinds of things that might help you get ready. And basically, if you're attending today's webinar, you're probably interested. So go forth and do it.
Okay, great. We have a very probably relevant question. How do these ideas translate to online courses? It seems like there's many in-class discussions, so how does that translate to online?
Yeah, what I have done, I haven't done a lot of online teaching, but for about 10 years I taught in an executive MBA program out of Madrid, and most of those sessions were online. But these were executive MBAs, so the quality of discussion was pretty high. But what I did was in any topic, whether it had to do with biases or anything else, I had structured online discussions in my course. And I think it's really important for you to structure the online discussions in the same way you would structure an in-class discussion. I would give students assignments where they do some personal reflection, and then there's some discussion and opportunity for them to share with others and to discuss it. So I would simply take the in-class activity and convert it to online.
Thank you. The next question here is probably many people are thinking about this. Everyone knows or understands this is a very important topic, but it's hard to fit it in. What would you give up in your course to fit this in?
I think that's the challenge that all of us face. I mean, it's a huge issue. What I have personally done in my courses is I have been really explicit to myself about what my priorities are in the course. And I place really high priority on critical thinking. I place less but still high priority on ethical reasoning. And then what that means is I have to make room for it. So what that also means is I have to go through my course content and basically say what's really important, what's not so important, and if it's not so important, it goes. Let me just share a comment. I think as accounting educators, we tend to teach way too much technical knowledge. And the students memorize 8 zillion things and then promptly forget it. In other words, we're sort of fooling ourselves if we think students are actually learning a lot of the technical knowledge that goes on in our courses. What I try to do is spend more time with topics that are high priority, both technical and professional skills, and then I just don't even bother with things that are not so important. Great.
Thank you. How do students respond to assessments such as the implicit association test?
I've actually found students to be fairly positive. Like I said, I've used these in different schools, in different places, different parts of the world. And I have found, especially undergraduate students, sort of interested in any assessment that has to do with them personally. Like, for example, Myers-Briggs. I did that for years in a critical thinking course, an undergraduate critical thinking course. And the students always really liked it. They kind of, they would say things like, wow, I never really realized that I was like this and there were other people in here like this too. I mean, they're into this community thing, a lot of our students. And so the idea that they're learning more about themselves and that they share some things with other people seems to be really valuable to a lot of them. So I have not had resistance from my students in using these kinds of activities, but I've also really emphasized to them why these activities are relevant to what we're doing in the course.
Great. Yeah, I've always found that Myers-Briggs and DISC analysis, all of the tests like that, they're very interesting, especially when you look at, like, say, if you're working and you look at an organization and how your department kind of spreads out that way. It's fascinating, really.
Right, right. And if you have your students doing teamwork, this can be really valuable. You know, like that team I mentioned that I met with where one student was resisting modifying the plan. See, that team could have had a real battle after they left my office over whether they were going to follow any of my advice or not.
Right. The next question has to do with the Wells Fargo situation, and you may have had this question from a student. But how do you answer the question about what the internal auditors should have done at Wells Fargo?
Well, actually, I turn it around the other way. So I use the Wells Fargo case. I'm currently teaching once a year a management control systems course in India. It's an MBA course, and so it's at a higher level. I actually had the students, because it's a control systems course, and internal audit is part of the control system. So I actually had them address that, like what kinds of controls could a company like Wells Fargo use to avoid this disaster that happened, and where were the internal auditors? And I actually looked for all kinds of articles to try to find any information at all about the internal auditors. I couldn't find it. It's just simply, I don't think it's publicly available today. It might become available in the future, as the case kind of fades into the history. But right now, I can't find a thing about the internal auditors. So the only thing that I'm doing with my students is have them talk about what the internal auditors should do or could do.
Right. That's a great way to pose it. Okay, we have time for one more question. So the last question here today, if you were to recommend one aspect of mindset to address in an accounting course, what would it be?
Well, I tend to focus on cognitive biases a lot, partly because they're so practical. I can tie a cognitive bias in with course content without a huge amount of work. And I think getting the students to become aware of the fact that they don't necessarily know that they have these biases, I think that's the real key. If I can help students recognize that bias can exist without your knowledge, that if students leave my course with that understanding, that alone is really important.
Right. Sometimes it's just the awareness alone that really just opens their eyes, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And hopefully what it does is encourages them to explore problems more thoroughly.
Right. Maybe think a minute before reacting, and sometimes that's just thinking before you say something or reacting, right?
Yep. I'm always telling my students to slow down.
Right.
It's kind of funny. I remember one time I was talking with a partner in a public accounting firm, one of the big firms, and I was talking with him at this time about my work on critical thinking. And his reaction to what I said was, "We can't afford to have our people sitting around thinking all day." And I'm thinking, maybe they should.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to turn it back over to Margaret.
Okay.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to thank our presenter, Susan Wolcott, for sharing her knowledge and expertise with us. We're very appreciative that she's made time for IMA and for our audience today. And also, thank you, Terry Moore-Mile, for moderating today's event. I want to again thank all of you for your participation in today's event, your commitment to IMA, and your professional development through IMA's Insight Talk Faculty Friday webinar series. I look forward to spending time with you again soon when we'll enjoy some more Insight Talk.